what I'd like to do is really talk about why we developed the standard, what are the myths, where did we struggle, the pitfalls and some of the consequences. Why did we develop a standard? Well, you can see here the results of the survey that was done via Complinet in Q1 2009. So 72% said, yes, wouldn't it be good? We could benefit as a profession in compliance from international standards, and that a standard could act as a benchmark for financial institutions and compliance professionals. Interestingly, a lot of people said, wouldn't it be good to see an international standard? But I think there were other reasons. A lot of us actually thought, look, this is a good thing. Financial services had, I think it's fair to say, had a bad press. Still are having a bad press. So if you were a compliance officer, did you introduce yourself as a compliance officer at parties? Because people said, well, first of all, what does that mean? Compliance, oh, is it complaints? Have you just spelt it wrongly? Where were you when everybody was doing what they shouldn't have been doing? So financial services had a bad press. Risk and compliance were being asked searching questions. My personal involvement, the reason I got involved was firstly because I was asked, but secondly, I meet a lot of compliance officers. I have traditionally reviewed for the last 5 years the effectiveness of a lot of compliance functions. And when I look at them, it's disappointing in one sense. Commercially, it's very healthy, but it's disappointing that one sees compliance functions which, frankly, are not where they need to be. I also train compliance officers. And when I train compliance officers, not just in this country, but abroad, a lot of them come to me and say, look, my senior management don't understand me. I feel like a bit like a marriage counsellor. My senior management don't understand me. They don't understand what I do. And they think I'm internal audit, or they think I'm a policeman, they think I'm an enforcer, and they don't really understand what the compliance function is. So how do we get that message across? And the good thing about this standard is not just about the compliance function, it's about the compliance framework. We wouldn't have put this together effectively if it didn't have something about the role and involvement of senior management within the compliance framework. So it's not just the compliance officers, the compliance department, it is the framework. And I train senior management quite often, and it's interesting to see how little they know about what a compliance function actually does. So the reason I got involved, and I'm sure a lot of my colleagues on the steering committee and the working group, was because we actually saw something good coming out of this. Now, where are the myths? This was an initiative dreamt up by the interested for the disinterested. I'll come on to the interested in a moment, but nobody wants it, we were told by some people. Who wants a compliance standard? Why do we need it? What good is it going to do? Well, hopefully I've answered that in a few of my comments just now. I think the industry does and did and does need a standard. Things can be improved. The standard will be a stick with which the FSA can beat firms. Well, we've seen the FSA's reaction to that. I'll come back to that in a moment as well. But some people said, well, the standard adds little to existing industry guidance. Well, where is that industry guidance? I have to say I didn't see a great deal of it. I remember back in the late 1980s, obviously I was in short trousers at the time, asking the FSA, well, okay, oh sorry, not the FSA, it would have been the TSA at the time, one of the predecessors. I'm in compliance, what do you expect us to do in terms of compliance and compliance monitoring? And they said, well, it's they didn't actually in those days use the word, it depends on the nature, scale and complexity of your business. That came a little bit later. But the FSA had no guidance on this at all. Really, they had no guidance on what compliance officers and compliance functions should be doing. They had no guidance on the interaction between the compliance function and senior management. They had no real guidance on areas of compliance training, compliance monitoring, compliance policy work, all this sort of stuff. When regulators came in to look at compliance functions, they would say, where is your compliance manual? And you would produce your 150-page compliance manual, and they would be delighted. Although you knew, and they probably knew also, that nobody actually read it, because nobody does read compliance manuals. You can see from the smiles around that you all know that as well. So, so there was little industry guidance. Yes, I think it was in July 2007, the FSA came out with a Dear CEO letter on compliance risk, which was compliance risks for investment banks. The FSA were quite cute. They started benchmarking firms outside the investment banking arena against that paper very shortly after it was issued. And it was a really good letter. It talked about compliance risk, the main elements of compliance risk and what firms should be doing. But before that, and actually since that, and forgive me if I'm doing anybody an injustice, because there may be some really good guidance out there that I just don't know about, that existing industry guidance really hasn't existed until now, until this standard. I'll wait for the rotten apples during the session this afternoon for anyone who disagrees with me. Conflicts of interest are rife. Peter, you're a consultant, so you're just developing the standard so that you can earn a small fortune from validating firms against the standard. Forgive me, I said this right at the beginning. My colleagues from the British Standards Institute might not like to hear this, but my personal view has always been that firms will do a lot of internal benchmarking. They will do it perhaps through their internal audit function, but there wasn't a great market for consultants such as I to go in and do this work. And at one stage I did actually say I probably wouldn't get involved in it anyway because I wouldn't want to be seen to have a conflict. Frankly, I don't see it as a conflict anyway. But we had two people on the working group who are consultants. A third one has since become a consultant, obviously attracted by the wonderful way of life, but a lot of the other people on the working group and the steering committee were representatives of the trade bodies and compliance officers themselves. So as a group, and there were lots of checks and balances, lots of questions to each other within those groups, I don't think conflicts of interest were, frankly, a major issue. There's a myth that valid comments on the draft were ignored. Trust me, we read every single comment, and we had mountains of comments. I say mountains. If it had actually been printed off, and I didn't to save paper, if it had printed off, I probably would have been able to, it would have dwarfed me in terms of paper. So we read through hundreds, thousands of comments. I didn't actually count them all, but there were lots of them. We agreed with many, we disagreed with some, but we ignored none of them. They were all read, and I'm sure I speak on behalf of a lot of my colleagues into the early hours they were being read. Another myth, of course, looking at the other side of the coin, is that the existence of a standard would have prevented the financial crisis. Well, I'm sure we're not really kidding ourselves there, are we? We can do certain things by having an effective compliance function, but preventing a financial crisis is probably a little bit beyond us.
Only a little bit.
Only a little bit, just a very small amount. Compliance officers are, of course, heroes. We all know that. But they're not quite that heroic. So what did we struggle with? We struggled with the scope, the geography. Should we include things like the Channel Islands, Isle of Man, etc., etc.? We did, of course, say at the beginning, this is crying out for an international standard. And it probably is. The UK, of course, has had a regulatory environment now since the mid to late 80s. And, well, some would argue before that, but I'm not sure I would. But we've had a regulatory environment since then. Whereas in other countries, regulators are a lot newer, And the compliance function is not something that they look at first of all. They look at how the markets work, etc., etc. So we focused on geography, the industry. What does the financial services industry mean? Do we cover just banks? Do we cover the wholesale, the retail? And of course, you know where we got to on that. But do we cover anti-money laundering and financial crime, which is growing by the year? Financial crime now involves anti-money laundering, counter-terrorist financing, fraud, market abuse, all sorts of other things. So, bribery and corruption, how can I forget that? So, it's a very, very wide area. We decided to include it, but we didn't want to have special sections on that because we took the view that your financial crime program and your compliance program or framework, I mustn't use program, I've been told off about that. I lost the battle on the use of the word compliance program. Compliance framework for general compliance things and for financial crime almost mirror each other. So we tended to include it but not be too specific in the area of financial crime. Now you probably can realise why this whole thing had the gestation period of which an elephant would be proud. It took a couple of years, I guess, from the first twinkle in the eyes to getting it out and to having this launch event. But there were lots of real logistical issues. Did we cover the framework? Did we cover the compliance function? And did we cover the individual responsibilities of the compliance officer? We focused really on the function and the framework, and we took the view that others are and probably will be looking at the individual qualifications and that sort of thing. And we had a real struggle with principles-based or prescriptive. Were we being too prescriptive? And it goes back to that question of whether the FSA would use this as a stick with which to beat firms. If we were too prescriptive, we wouldn't be addressing that concern. If we were too prescriptive, it may not be proportionate for the smaller firms. And we had a champion of the smaller firms, Ian Cornwall, from whom you'll hear later, who was constantly saying to us, and quite rightly, don't forget, this isn't always about the large firms. We've got to think about compliance functions with one person in it. And that person has to do probably all of these things that we're covering here. So we had to keep it a principles-based document rather than make it too prescriptive. So what are the pitfalls? Well, regulation by the back door. This is one we spent a lot of time working on. Another stick to beat us with. Well, my view right from the beginning, and I'm pleased to say it stayed with me, is a well-run firm, a well-run compliance function and well-run compliance framework should have nothing to fear from this standard. If you're a larger firm and you're not doing anything that's in the standard, you ought to be. Now, I speak from experience there. You really ought to be. So if you're a smaller firm, you need to be doing all of those things. I was about to say tick all those boxes, but we don't like tick box approaches anymore. But you ought to be ticking those boxes. You ought to be thinking about training, compliance risk, compliance monitoring, senior management, involvement, interaction with senior management. You ought to be doing those things, but will you be doing them as comprehensively as perhaps somebody in a larger firm with a large team around them? Maybe not. Maybe not. You also have situations with very small firms where you don't have a dedicated compliance officer. You may have one of the partners or one of the directors who is also the CF10, a position I don't envy. I don't necessarily envy CF10, but CF10 and CF3 or CF1 is quite a difficult position. And we have to think of those people as well. Now, so again, we've tried to be proportionate. We've tried to be proportionate so that this standard can apply to all types of compliance functions and frameworks within all types of firms. And it's a voluntary standard. Do we believe this? Do we believe that the FSA will make sure it's a voluntary standard? Or do we think that the FSA will actually come along and say, right, here's a standard, benchmark yourself. And by the way, we've read this in the 8543, and you're not doing this, or you're not doing this to the extent mentioned in the standard. Why are you not, and what are you going to do about it? Or, more importantly, what are we, the FSA, going to do about it? Do we believe this? Well, I think we do believe this, and we should believe this, but we should be careful. Of course, if the standard is out there, and it's saying, this is good practice, in some cases it may be best practice, but if this is good practice, why should firms not be measuring them against it? Now, this is not me touting for business, because you can do this yourselves. You have internal audit functions. Do we have any internal auditors in the room here? No? Okay. I've been internally audited as a compliance officer on countless occasions, and I have to say the standard of that audit has been almost universally lamentable, except for the last one I had, which was really good. Actually very, very good. But apart from that, it's been lamentable. This actually will help, I think, to raise standards, because internal auditors will start to understand what they need to look at in compliance, and they have been largely clueless up until now, in my experience. They may have gotten a lot better recently. I'm seeing a few nods around the room, so I'm glad I'm not the only one that thinks that. So it will help to raise standards in terms of internal validation. And there's no reason why you cannot, if you are a compliance officer, do self-validation of this. In fact, I would absolutely recommend it. I've told a lot of compliance officers I know, look at this standard and validate yourself against this. So what are the consequences? Well, yes, we now have this standard against which we can benchmark ourselves. And I think that is a good thing. We also have a standard to show to senior management, because this standard actually not only says what the compliance function ought to be doing, but it says what senior management should be doing. So compliance officers need to have the courage to go to senior management and say, this is good practice, this is what the industry is doing and what the industry expects. You may have to choose your words carefully about what the regulator expects, but you've seen that. You've seen the quotes from the FSA. So it's in the background, the FSA know it's there, they will look at it, and they may well have a copy of it in their back pocket when they come in to see firms. But it's not just about the function, it's about senior management. Is senior management giving the compliance community the support that it needs? If not, this is a standard that you can give to your senior management and say, this is what other firms are doing. So, yes, there is the possibility of external validation. And we've heard the views of the FSAs and the auditors. So, we know what the FSA is thinking about here. We know what the FSA's priorities are generally. It's down to the compliance community now to look at themselves, but also to look at their own senior management in firms and say, this is what the industry is doing, we're getting your sponsorship, thank you very much. Or there may be areas in which we can improve and where we need more sponsorship. We need more resource, and we need the right culture of support for compliance and compliance culture. And if any firm has had an Arrow visit in the last 6 to 9 months and has not been asked about their compliance culture, then you've probably not got one of the better supervisors on your patch. They're asking about that all of the time. What is your compliance culture? How do you demonstrate compliance culture? I think this standard will help in that. And so much of it is about measuring, identifying, measuring and managing compliance risk. And I still talk to compliance officers, a large number of them, when I talk to them about what they need to do with their function, and say, what are you doing about compliance risk? And they haven't actually got that building block in place. Now this standard helps with that, but you shouldn't need a standard to be able to do this. This is what we're here for. We're here for compliance risk or regulatory risk management.